What if I told you that one of the most powerful empires in history was defeated by a group of colonies that had no professional army, little money, and almost no chance of winning? In 1775, the mighty British Empire controlled territories across the globe. Its army was feared, its navy ruled the seas, and its king expected complete loyalty from his American colonies. Yet just 8 years later, Britain would lose 13 colonies and witness the birth of a new nation, the United States of America. This is the story of courage, rebellion, sacrifice, and a revolution that changed the world forever. In the mid-1700s, Britain controlled 13 colonies along the eastern coast of North America. Life in these colonies was generally prosperous. Farmers cultivated vast lands, merchants traded goods across the Atlantic, and towns continued to grow. Most colonists considered themselves loyal British subjects. They spoke English, followed British laws, and proudly belonged to the British Empire. For many years, Britain allowed the colonies considerable freedom to manage their own affairs. Local assemblies handled many governmental responsibilities while remaining loyal to the Crown. However, everything changed after the French and Indian War ended in 1763. Britain had won a major victory against France, but the war left the government buried under enormous debt. British leaders believed that since troops were stationed in North America to protect the colonies, the colonists should help pay the costs. The colonists saw things differently. When Britain introduced new taxes, many Americans became furious. One of the most controversial laws was the Stamp Act of 1765. It required taxes on newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and many printed materials. The colonists argued that they had no representatives in the British Parliament. Their complaint was simple but powerful: no taxation without representation. Protests spread across the colonies. Merchants boycotted British goods. Public meetings condemned the taxes. Crowds intimidated tax collectors. Although Britain eventually repealed the Stamp Act, trust had already begun to crumble. More taxes followed, and with every new law, resentment grew. The relationship between Britain and its colonies became increasingly tense. In Boston, tensions reached dangerous levels. British troops were stationed in the city to maintain order and enforce British policies. Many colonists viewed the soldiers not as protectors, but as occupiers. On the evening of March 5, 1770, a confrontation erupted between a crowd and a group of British soldiers. Angry colonists shouted insults. Snowballs and objects were thrown. Then suddenly, shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre. Patriot leaders used the event to fuel anti-British sentiment throughout the colonies. The divide continued to widen. 3 years later, another dramatic event pushed the colonies even closer to rebellion. In 1773, Britain passed the Tea Act. Many colonists viewed it as yet another attempt to impose unfair taxation. On a cold December night, a group of protesters disguised themselves as Native Americans boarded ships in Boston Harbor. They opened hundreds of tea chests and dumped them into the icy water. By morning, more than 340 chests of tea had been destroyed. The protest became famous as the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded with anger. The government imposed harsh punishments known as the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed. Self-government was restricted. British control tightened. But instead of crushing resistance, these measures united the colonies. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia to discuss a common response. The First Continental Congress was formed. Meanwhile, both sides quietly prepared for war. Colonial militias stockpiled weapons and ammunition. British authorities closely monitored their activities. The breaking point arrived in April 1775. British troops marched toward Concord, Massachusetts, intending to seize colonial military supplies. At Lexington, they encountered armed colonial militiamen. The two sides faced each other in tense silence. Then a shot echoed across the battlefield. No one knows who fired first, but that single gunshot would become known as the shot heard around the world. The American Revolutionary War had begun. Soon afterward, one of the first major battles took place at Bunker Hill. Although British forces eventually captured the position, they suffered heavy casualties. The battle demonstrated that colonial fighters could stand against professional British soldiers. As fighting intensified, the colonies needed leadership. The Continental Congress appointed George Washington as commander of the Continental Army. Washington faced an enormous challenge. His army lacked training, supplies, uniforms, weapons, and money. Many soldiers served only briefly before returning home. Desertion was common. Defeat seemed possible at any moment. Yet Washington understood something important. He did not necessarily need to destroy the British army. He simply needed to keep the revolution alive. As long as his army survived, hope survived. Meanwhile, many colonists had reached a critical conclusion. Reconciliation with Britain was no longer possible. In June 1776, a committee was formed to draft a declaration explaining why the colonies sought independence. Its principal author was Thomas Jefferson. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted. The document announced that the colonies were no longer subjects of King George III. They were free and independent states. The Declaration proclaimed revolutionary ideas: that all men are created equal, that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that people have the right to replace governments that violate their rights. These principles would inspire democratic movements around the world for centuries, but declaring independence was much easier than winning it. The Americans soon faced some of the darkest days of the war. British forces captured New York City. Washington's army suffered defeat after defeat. Morale collapsed. Many believed the revolution was nearing its end. Then came one of the most daring moments in American history. On Christmas night, 1776, George Washington led his soldiers across the icy Delaware River. Battling freezing temperatures and dangerous conditions, they crossed into enemy territory. At dawn, they launched a surprise attack against Hessian troops stationed in Trenton. The victory shocked the British. Soon another success followed at Princeton. These victories restored confidence and gave the revolution new life. The war continued. In 1777, Britain launched an ambitious strategy aimed at isolating New England from the other colonies. General John Burgoyne led a large British army south from Canada. Initially, the plan appeared promising. However, American forces blocked his advance. After a series of battles near Saratoga, New York, Burgoyne found himself trapped. Surrounded and outnumbered, he had no choice but to surrender. The American victory at Saratoga became the turning point of the war. For the first time, foreign powers believed the Americans might actually win. Most importantly, France decided to join the conflict. This changed everything. France had long been Britain's greatest rival. French leaders saw an opportunity to weaken their enemy. In 1778, France officially allied itself with the United States. French money, weapons, soldiers, and naval forces began flowing to the American cause. Soon Spain and the Dutch Republic also entered the broader conflict against Britain. The Revolutionary War was no longer a colonial rebellion. It had become a global struggle. Britain suddenly faced enemies around the world. Its resources were stretched thin. Even with foreign support, victory remained uncertain. During the winter of 1777 and 1778, Washington's army camped at Valley Forge. Conditions were brutal. Food shortages plagued the camp. Disease spread rapidly. Many soldiers lacked proper clothing. Some marched barefoot through snow, leaving bloody footprints behind. Thousands suffered. Hundreds died. Yet Valley Forge became a place of transformation. A skilled Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben arrived and began training the army. He introduced discipline, organization, and modern military techniques. By spring, the Continental Army had become stronger, more professional, and more capable. The soldiers emerged ready for the challenges ahead. As the war dragged on, Britain shifted its focus to the southern colonies. British leaders believed they would find stronger support there. Initially, the strategy seemed successful. British forces captured important cities, including Savannah and Charleston. However, resistance continued. American commanders adopted flexible tactics. Instead of risking everything in one decisive battle, they gradually wore down British forces through constant pressure and smaller engagements. The British won battles, but they struggled to maintain control. The war continued to drain resources and morale. Then came the final chapter. By 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis established his army at Yorktown, Virginia. He expected support from the British Navy. But events soon took an unexpected turn. A powerful French fleet defeated British naval forces at the Battle of the Chesapeake. This prevented Cornwallis from escaping by sea. At the same time, George Washington and French General Rochambeau marched south with their armies. Yorktown was surrounded. American and French forces tightened the noose. For weeks, artillery pounded British defenses. Day after day, the bombardment continued. Cornwallis found himself trapped. His position became hopeless. On October 19, 1781, British troops marched out and surrendered. More than 7,000 soldiers laid down their arms. The Siege of Yorktown effectively ended major fighting in the Revolutionary War. Although some negotiations remained, Britain's political leaders understood that the conflict could no longer be won. In 1783, representatives from Britain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris. Britain officially recognized American independence. The United States emerged as a sovereign nation. Against extraordinary odds, 13 colonies had defeated one of the most powerful empires on earth. Yet victory came at a tremendous cost. Thousands of soldiers died from combat, disease, hunger, and hardship. Families were divided by loyalty and politics. Cities and farms suffered destruction. Many loyalists who had supported Britain fled the new nation. Native American nations faced devastating consequences as American settlement expanded westward. And despite the language of liberty and equality, slavery remained firmly entrenched. Women continued to lack political rights. The promises of the Revolution would take generations to fully pursue. Nevertheless, the American Revolution changed history. It demonstrated that a determined people could challenge imperial power. It spread ideas about liberty, self-government, and individual rights. Its influence crossed oceans and inspired future revolutions in Europe, Latin America, and beyond. What began as protests over taxes evolved into a struggle that reshaped the modern world. From a mysterious shot at Lexington to the surrender at Yorktown, the American Revolutionary War became one of history's most remarkable stories. A story of courage against overwhelming odds, a story of sacrifice and determination, and a story that proved that even the mightiest empire can be challenged when people are willing to fight for their vision of freedom. The world would never be the same again. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating stories, epic battles, and world-changing events from the past.